Welcome to another episode of the Simply Verified Beef podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Bray Patterson from the west coast of BC, and today's topic is all about water. We've got a couple water experts on this panel today, so we're going to turn it over to John and Noreen to introduce themselves. So John, Noreen, whoever wants to take it first, please introduce yourself.
I'm John Anderson. My wife Kate and I and our 4 children own a ranch southeast of Merritt in the Cane Valley, which is sort of just on the cusp of the Coquihalla Cascades range. I think the important thing for me to have people understand is we have several big rivers that run through, well, they wouldn't be big compared to a lot of rivers, but they're big for us, running out of our Nicola watershed. And they're very volatile rivers. They flood, and we have extreme droughts here. So we're sort of in flood mode or drought mode or fire mode. So we've had quite a year in this past 2021. Why water is important to us is just for those very reasons. We need water for cattle. We need water for crops. We also need water for wild things to live because we place a very high value on the ecology that we live with, the riparian areas and the range areas that we use. So I'm a BC Cattlemen's director and have been for some 10 years, soon to be retiring from that. And I'm also a chair and have been for a couple of decades of the Nicola Watershed Community Roundtable. And that is a group that does a lot of work in the Nicola watershed, educating on a number of issues, but water being probably the priority one.
One other thing, you and Kate were also the Ranch Sustainability Award winners for BC Cattlemen's a few years ago. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we were awarded the 2015 Environmental Stewardship Award from BC Cattlemen's.
Excellent. Well, thank you, John. And Noreen.
So my name's Noreen Ambrose. I'm the executive director with Cows and Fish, or the more legal long name is the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society, but most people, certainly in the agricultural sector, know us as Cows and Fish. And so my role as the executive director is to do the usual kinds of things that people in that position, like find grants and report on grants, but oversee our program. And a lot of that work includes outreach and education with ranching communities, as well as other communities around water. Riparian areas, which John already mentioned, are those places next to water, those sort of transition zones. And so we do a lot of work, educational side, but also we do monitor riparian health with landowners and community groups. We do a lot of hands-on sort of field days, and we support management changes with folks like John, but also with restoration events where we're, maybe working with volunteers on projects. So I'm really pleased to be here today. And water is, of course, something we all need. And it's also really powerful. Like it has a lot of erosive power, whether it's wave action or flowing water, but it's something we all need, not only to live, but our agricultural sectors need it. And so do most other sectors. But it's kind of that interface of land and water that's really sensitive too, right? Because what we do in the land is reflected in the water.
Thank you, John and Noreen, for introducing yourselves. As you guys can hear, we've got a couple of experts and people who are very passionate about water, regardless if it's in Alberta or in BC. So before we dive into our questions, I'll quickly cover what water means to the Verified Beef Production Plus program. It falls under our pillar of environmental stewardship. Again, we also talk about water when we think about animal health as well, but for today's episode, we are concentrating on the environmental stewardship pillar of VBP Plus. So we kind of itemize it into 4 little subcategories: water quality, riparian areas, irrigation and drainage, and then feedlots or confined areas. And so with water quality, obviously making sure that producers are keeping the highest quality water for animals and plants and those in the community. With riparian areas, we're obviously encouraging producers to help manage those in an effective and appropriate way. So maybe utilizing stock tanks outside away from riparian areas so we don't have cows squishing fish. Obviously, with irrigation and drainage, we want to see that your irrigation is getting that water to the plant in the most effective way possible. And when we look at it from feedlot and confined areas, making sure that we don't have accidental runoff and other mismatches like that. So that's kind of what VP looks at from the VP Plus umbrella. So the first question we have is, what are key practices that you implement on your operation to keep cattle and riparian areas healthy and safe?
What I would suggest are probably the key practices that we use to keep our riparian areas healthy. And I'm not sure if safe's the right word, because when there's flooding and other things, there's always some risk involved with living next to any riparian area, especially large water rivers. But I think a good strategy that we've implemented over the last number of decades is a managed grazing strategy. So we do own the land right to the river's edge and right to some of the lake's edges that we manage. And we don't really want to give up the grazing in those areas, but we are come up with a good system that allows us to manage graze it in certain seasons where we feel there's going to be a minimal and maybe even a positive impact with that managed grazing. To that end, then, we also need to have off-stream cattle watering, which we have slowly built up over a period of time. I guess another important tool that for us on range, especially on Crown Range, is using salt appropriately. If we use salt the right way, we can also have an influence on where cattle congregate with regard to riparian areas. We have an irrigation screen, which we're quite proud of, that I think other people obviously probably use, but it's a mesh screen that uses some water that's pumped back from the pump to turn it, and it revolves, and it's a Sureflow screen it's called, but it revolves, keeping the screen clean and also keeping fish from sticking to the screen if the suction becomes, so it's a very self-cleaning screen. That's a great irrigation tool. The cattle wintering area is a real challenge for us personally because of the fact that the valley all slopes down towards the valley bottom, and where we winter our cattle is in the valley bottom. So it's something that we try and have a buffer zone between where we feed and where the water bodies are, and that buffer zone, I believe, is important because it has a filtration process that's used for any excessive runoff from cattle manure.
I think those are all great ways to help manage your waterways and your water systems as well, and keep your herd safe, plant safe, soil safe, water safe as well. Noreen, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I not a ton of specifics, but I will say, it seems to me that the things that John mentioned are really in keeping with really good grazing principles. So it doesn't matter if you're grazing at a riparian area or a non-riparian, that's what we call an upland, a drier place, is you want to make sure you're balancing your stock and how much forage you're taking with what's sustainable, which seems obvious, but sometimes we don't actually take time to think about that, or some areas do get overused if we aren't paying attention to those things. So there's balanced supply and demand. Basically, there's making sure you have adequate rest after growth, and a lot of ranchers are automatically just doing that, but I think it's good to mention it is, in these, like last year, there was a lot of droughts in Western North America especially, and during a dry period, rest doesn't count. If there's no growth after it's used, it's not regrowing and replenishing the stocks for the plants. And obviously it's not resting in the winter because it's not generally growing. Maybe in some parts of BC and in the Maritimes at times there's growth, but generally, it's active growth that it needs in what rest is actually about. And then timing, John talked about that. I think winter is really probably the trickiest. So I would say, always looking at how do you avoid the sensitive periods or minimize the impacts, and except for winter use, that sort of that a lot of that is that spring when it's soft and wet and compactable. The physical impacts can be the hardest, and it's also the hardest on the plants because plants are just starting to grow and they're using all their energy that they've got in their roots to put out their first few leaves, because until they have leaves, they can't photosynthesize, obviously. So that early spring use is quite hard. And likewise, even fall use, when there's little leaves left, that's when cows tend to seek trees and shrubs because they maintain nutritional value, even if there's not leaf matter on them. And trees and shrubs are integral, kind of that natural rebar to hold the shore and the stream banks together. So those are kind of timing issues to look at, and then distribution, which John talked about. How do you get them to leave the manure where you want it? Because the livestock watering system and the salting are super important. They're the most two important distribution tools for sure. So, and winter feeding locations, like when you're going to have frozen ground, is like the buffers that John talked about, really important. So I would say that as long as you're thinking about those four principles, there's a gazillion ways to do them. And it certainly sounds like John's and his family are putting a lot of those in place like a year round, which is really important.
Totally. I think that's a key portion, is putting it in year round, so that when you do get hit by some extra stressors, such as a flood or drought, you can actually have effective forage ready for your animals and an effective and healthy riparian area waiting for when other animals can return to it. So I did mention the word flood, and for anyone who has not heard about the floods of southern BC, I highly suggest you do a quick Google search, because there's quite a few people who have been affected regardless of what commodity. Obviously, a lot of beef producers have been affected, dairy producers, poultry producers, small lot, large lot, you name it. Producers across BC have been affected by the floods, and John happens to be one of them. So John, do you want to kind of talk about how the recent floods have affected your operation, particularly when we think about water and riparian health?
I think the most important thing to recognize when we have a huge water event like we had last November of 2021 is the tremendous force of the water and the ability of it to change channels, to actually erode very large pieces of property in a single day or two, and to really deposit a lot of debris, a lot of gravel, and a lot of trees, I mean literally full-size trees across a lot of the lowlands. So we have experienced about 7 of these floods now over the last 25 years. And I would say this last one was definitely the biggest, I mean, by a long shot, by about double the volume of what we normally would have, almost 3 times the volume of water. So what it does is you need to have a plan on how you're going to let that water escape. So it needs to widen out, and it needs to flow through those very same riparian areas that we're speaking about in order to diffuse the energy of that big river system that's coming down. And so to that end, I wouldn't say we're 100% successful, because we have had erosion from that flood, but we're probably a little bit better off than a lot of people, because the river is wide and we've allowed it to become that way. Well, it's just done it on its own. All we're doing is recognizing what it's doing naturally. And we have a very robust and significant riparian area along some of the corners. So the water can actually flood through there and take a lot of force and energy out of the water. I guess a significant upside, if there is an upside to a giant flood, is the amount of topsoil that gets laid down in one of these flood events in 24 to 48 hours is very significant. And in some places, we've gotten a foot of soil where the tools are in place to be able to capture them. So I think it's really important to view it from 2 aspects, 3 really. One is erosion. How are you going to manage that? Number 2, channel width, super important. The third thing really is to allow for that diffusion of energy in flood. And we use a lot of high tensile electric fencing, so that when a flood goes through and we have 3 feet of debris, we can actually just pull the electric wire out of it and refence it without having, like a barbed wire fence is pretty much impossible to fix or salvage after a flood event. So I think recognizing the significance of the water, the energy of the water, and planning for how you're going to allow that water to flow through and not have a narrow channel that just increases the velocity. That's an important factor.
I think those are really good factors, and obviously not just applicable to ag operations. I also live in the same valley as John and was affected by the flood too. And I can think about the various homes in my neighborhoods that were taken out because they didn't have a big channel to move the water through. And unfortunately, my river rocks have returned to the river. I now have the river living in my backyard where it shouldn't be, but I digress. Floods are quite the adventure for everyone, and obviously a good learning experience for our province to figure out how we can better manage our various producers, regardless of how they farm or ranch around the province. So what are some best management practices for water or riparian areas based on your province that you would give to producers in your area? Noreen, would you like to go first?
So I think, what are considered best or beneficial management practices, the core is the same everywhere. The regulatory side might be a little different in different provinces, but I would say the kinds of things that John just talked about is you've got to give the river or the stream room. And that's like leaving that what you would call the floodplain and the meander belt. Maybe the river hasn't been there for a while or even a long while, but that floodplain is the release valve. And, John talked really well about how it's the place that you dissipate energy and actually reduce erosive forces. Because if it all stays in a skinny channel, that same amount of water would need a canyon. And the great benefit of having healthy vegetation in your riparian area is you trap material, which is topsoil from someplace else who lost it, and rebuild great rich soils. And that's why they're also really good for growing, abundant forage usually. So I think, those keeping those pieces and, the fencing, it's in the early days, like 20 years ago, when I started doing this work, 22 years ago, it was like, oh, we don't want to fence anything out. We're going to always graze to the water's edge. And now producers are often fencing it out either to exclude or just to control timing. But they're recognizing putting the fence further back is really that's a much better practice than right up next to like on the bank, right, a couple feet or a meter or two from the water, because not only of the flood impacts, but I mean, the channel does move and eventually carves away. That's what streams and rivers do. Even wetlands and lakes, right? The water levels naturally change. You can't manage something so skinny and small either as a grazing unit, whereas if it's a bit bigger, it can be a grazable corridor or a riparian pasture that you can treat differently than elsewhere. So I would say that's like one of the pieces for people to keep doing. And offsite watering systems, that's the other thing I would say. They're a great tool, but if they're right beside the water, they're kind of not really gaining a lot of the benefit of distribution that they could, because the whole point of them is to redistribute livestock. And if you put them right beside the water, you're kind of losing that benefit. So to me, that's a gap I see sometimes still. And the timing, it's tough. At the end of winter, you want to get out there as early as you can and graze as early as there's grass out there, but the longer you can hold off, the better, because it's better for the plants. There's kind of the old stockman saying, for every week you delay in the spring, you get 2 weeks of grazing in the fall, which can add up to a lot of more plant matter, right? So I would say those are some really common things. And the buffer, like, a lot of agricultural producers have cattle or some other kind of livestock, and they do some cropping, whether that's perennial forages or whatever, or annuals, and trying to avoid cultivating riparian areas because they are typically on a floodplain or a shoreline, so they will potentially erode, and if you don't have perennial deep-rooted vegetation, then they might wash away, and that's not great, or your inputs are lost. If you're growing a crop, they get buried or flooded or inaccessible, that kind of thing. So that'd be some other suggestions I'd have.
I think those are great points. And I think one of the things I took away was that over the years, things have changed and progressed. Because I can even think about when I was a kid and what we did with our manure management along riparian areas, definitely not what I would ever encourage anyone to do nowadays. And that was, 15, 20 years ago as well. So, John, what are your thoughts on this from a producer's perspective?
Well, I think the best management practice, really, the one that probably is the hurdle for most people to really get their mind around, is the one that Noreen mentioned, and that's to have larger fence sections for riparian areas. And the way you arrive to that point of thinking is to think about, as opposed to the loss of grazing that you're going to get there, try and think about the increased values that you're going to get by managing the grazing in the appropriate time of year, and by reducing the cost of erosion and flooding, and by the increased production of soil capture during these flood events. So I think a bigger fence section we all kind of start off being pretty close to the water, and then as we become more comfortable with things, we tend to graze a fence further away from the water and then use those as pastures. And I think the herd impact is important because it also brings on natural succession. So I don't think you want to exclude cattle from areas. I think you want to use cattle as a tool to promote the type of succession you want. And with regard to the grazing practices, just remembering that plants grow, the most important part of the plant is the one you don't see, which is under the ground. So managing your grazing so that you are always allowing those plants to replenish their root system before they go dormant. I think that's over time how people become really good at managing grazing. They have strong grazing areas because the plants are given the time to rest, rebuild their root systems, and that in itself is a way to control flooding and overland water flow and all those things. So that would be, I think, some of the and probably the final one is, having that area between where your cattle are and where, like in our case, along the Nicola River, it's an excellent filtration system. I don't think that is given enough recognition by regulators and other people, but if you have a robust filtration system between where your cattle are and where rivers run, I think that's something that we should emphasize a little bit more as an industry, as opposed to panicking when people see runoff heading towards downhill towards any kind of water. So that's all obviously based on volume. Obviously, if it's a torrent of water running off the hill, it's different than if it's just a slow gradual amount.
Totally. I think it's important to refer to different regulations in your provinces as well. So in BC, we have something called the MCOPs, the Agricultural Environment Code of Practice. And that would be a great reference, as well as obviously reaching out to various different professionals. In BC, we have a program called FRISP, Farmland Riparian Interface Stewardship Program. And we have a gentleman named Lee Hesketh who manages that. He's a great resource. Obviously, Cows and Fish are a great resource in Alberta, and the various different provinces will have different ones as well. But before we wrap this up, is there any other key points you'd like the listenership to think about when it comes to water and things they should consider on their own operations, or if maybe their industry helping advise an operation? What would be, if there's any other takeaways? This has been a great conversation, though.
Yeah, I'd love to add, I think, we think about the water in, maybe drinking water terms, but we forget sometimes about, because obviously we all drink water. Somebody's downstream of us, whether it's a person or a cow or anything, or irrigation, a city. We also really need riparian areas for water quantity, not only because floods happen and you need a place for it to spread out, but water storage is really important. And natural water storage is something we can't really see. We see the channel or we see the pond of water maybe in a wetland or a lake, but we don't see the underground. And that's actually another really important reason to have healthy grazing practices, because it stores more water, which is not only good in floods because it dissipates and rebuilds, but in droughts, right? And so I think, we never know when one of those is coming, a drought or a flood. But, having that sort of that healthy landscape adjacent to the water is critical for, getting through those anomalies and those extremes. You could have a drought where you have no forage or very little in both the riparian or the upland, especially where it's drier. But you can have zero production because it's been flooded out too. It's underwater or it's buried in a foot of sediment, like John talked about. And how do you plan for that? Well, not grazing at the very last little bit, always planning ahead to have reserve, forage and litter cover and stuff like that. And I think as we start to see more and more extremes, that's going to be more important to have that resiliency sort of in your grazing plan.
Totally. I think that is key. John, do you have anything else to add?
Of course, Bree. So I would like to say that there's a couple of things that I think as an industry we need to be really aware of. We're all aware of regulatory overburden and, all those processes. So I don't really need to go through that with people because they'll hear from government on all kinds of fronts. But one of the things that as an industry I think we need to really become aware of is that riparian areas add a lot of value to a lot of things that are not necessarily part of our agricultural production cycle, but they're very valuable to the species that live there, and they're very valuable to society in general. So on those two fronts, you have an opportunity to manage for something to keep it healthy and robust so that the species that are natural to that area are very also in a healthy state. And I think that the society that looks at that healthy, robust riparian area recognizes that the industry is working towards that. And I think that's an important factor just from our ability to be able to go forward to the public and say, look, we're doing a great job at a very low cost of looking after these areas. And finally, I would add that in our area where we have a lot of drought, the cool water, building on Noreen's point, the cool water that flows through the ground and back out into our rivers and streams is essential for the survival of salmonoid species and all fish in total, really. So when we get high water temperatures in our water here, the thing that does keep them surviving is that cool flow of water coming through riparian areas back into the stream. And I think that's another extremely important thing that we need to recognize, that water, actually the greatest store of water on the planet is soil. You know, we hear about trees, we hear about dams, we hear about all these other things, but good, healthy topsoil and with a good water mineral cycle stores more water than any of all the other combinations together. So I think that's another good reason to have really good, healthy areas for cattle to produce on and live next to.
Totally. I think there's a quote out there that says we owe our existence to the top 6 inches of soil. So that's a good key takeaway there as well, that obviously soil is a great reserve for water. But thank you guys very much for joining in. Thanks, Noreen. Thanks, John. This has been a fabulous conversation. And until next time, we'd like to thank our sponsors again, since without them, we couldn't have this fabulous show for you guys to tune into.
So thank you to the Canadian Agricultural Partnership through New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. See you next month.
Catch you guys later.